If you haven't been in-house, you might be confused about Broadridge's role in the proxy plumbing process. Or maybe even if you're familiar with that, you might not be aware of all that Broadridge is capable of doing today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romack, and I'm a big fan of yous. So I'm going to go through 5 things you should know about Broadridge. The first being that they are an important conduit between beneficial owners, shareholders who hold their securities in street name, the retail holders, and the company itself. One of the hardest things to wrap one's head around is, if you're not familiar with the proxy plumbing process, is that companies don't know who their shareholders are, most of them anyways, so they can't directly communicate with their shareholders. Now, proxy plumbing is a term meant to describe how the sausage is made in terms of how shareholders vote through a myriad of layers of ownership in which a number of third parties play a huge role, as some duties, some services are outsourced to them. Broadridge is one of those key parties. Now, Broadridge is key because it has an exclusive contract, an exclusive relationship with most brokers and banks on the street to handle their voting and delivery obligations on their behalf with their clients, meaning that Broadridge knows who most of your shareholders are, but they're not allowed to tell you because many shareholders elect to keep their identity confidential. They're anonymous to the company. So the fact that they own a company stock is unknown to the company. So let me say it again and make sure I'm clear. Broadridge not only knows who your shareholders are, they're the only ones who knows who your shareholders are. So we'll let that sink in. So that's why when I was on the speaking circuit many moons ago, when Broadridge was spun off from ADP as its own standalone public company, I used to highlight during those speaking gigs, if there's only one thing you learn from me today, it's that you should run out and buy Broadridge stock immediately. So if a company wants to communicate with those shareholders whose identity remains confidential, anonymous to the company, they have to hire Broadridge to accomplish that. That puts Broadridge in a pretty powerful position. If companies need to communicate with their shareholders, maybe there's an item on this year's annual meeting ballot where the vote is probably going to pretty close and the company wants to make sure the vote goes their way, or maybe it's a proxy contest, a contested election. Those companies are going to want to actively solicit shareholders to bring in the vote favorably to them. So they're going to be paying Broadridge for every communication they make to shareholders, whether it be in print or electronically. So the second thing I want to discuss is how Broadridge handles the voting and delivery obligations for banks and brokers. So as I mentioned a minute ago, Broadridge is key because it has an exclusive contract, an exclusive relationship with most banks and brokers on the street to handle their voting and delivery obligations for them. So what did I mean by that? Nearly every broker and bank has signed a contract with Broadridge to perform the obligations that these brokers and banks have with their clients, for their clients, and they outsource these tasks to Broadridge so they don't have to do these tasks themselves. This includes the distribution of proxy materials, collecting the proxies back. Actually, they're called voting instruction forms. See my separate Vid-Guide to understand the difference between VIFs, voting instruction forms, and proxy cards. A link to that video is below. Tabulating the votes cast by these retail holders, these VIFs, and handle the responses for any request to handle shareholder lists. So nearly every broker and bank have a relationship with Broadridge like this, an exclusive one. So Broadridge has a near monopoly here. It's nearly impossible for another provider to get into this business because Broadridge has a well-oiled machine. They are good at what they do. I've been out to their big plant on Long Island myself, although it's been a while, and I've seen the operation up close, the one that handles the print mailings. And it's mammoth. They have billions of dollars invested in this plant. So a competitor would have to make quite an investment to try to get their foot in the door. And did I mention that the contracts that Broadridge has with these brokers and banks being exclusive? Exclusive. So I do think Broadridge has one competitor, albeit pretty small, median. I think they do have a few banker broker clients. So there is one alternative out there. So who pays for what? Well, under the New York Stock Exchange's Rule 451, banks and brokers are New York Stock Exchange member organization. So that's why this is a NYSE rule thing. The banks and brokers hold securities in street name for their clients, and they are required to deliver on behalf of the companies whose stock is held by their clients proxy materials to beneficial owners if they are assured that they will receive reasonable reimbursement of expenses for such distributions from the company. So the SEC's rules put the burden on the banks and brokers to deliver the proxy materials that the companies print up and then the banks and brokers distribute those materials down to the beneficial owners, down to their clients. So for this service, companies are required to reimburse these banks and brokers for all out-of-pocket expenses. So companies are required under this rule, Rule 451, to have their proxy materials delivered by the banks and brokers to these street holders, the retail investors, and then the banks and brokers reimburse them for doing so. But the banks and brokers decided long ago it was more economical to outsource this hassle to a third party who specializes in this kind of thing rather than do it themselves. And that's where Broadridge comes in. So this seems really confusing because it is really confusing. And in practice now, Broadridge not only handles this for the banks and brokers, but they even remove the banks and brokers from the invoicing part. Broadridge will bill the companies directly rather than run the bill to the bank and broker who would then otherwise send it on to the company. So in terms of invoicing, there's no middleman, no middlewoman. You got it? So Broadridge is able to invoice companies for something they were hired by someone else to handle. So I don't know much about the actual invoicing process. I've never heard folks talk about this on panels. I've never experienced it myself. But there is this annual guidebook from Broadridge that is pretty useful to understand this process. And this page 42 in the guidebook from the 2020 version, notes that there will be as many as 4 invoices for a proxy mailing. So each company will get as many as 4 invoices from Broadridge for a proxy mailing. The guidebook describes the various fees that might be included on these invoices. That's on page 44 of the guidebook. Processing fee, preference management fee, intermediary nominee coordination fee, postage processing fee, bulk processing fee, drop shipment fee, notice and access fee. It sounds complicated, these invoices from Broadridge, and it's something you need to be directly involved with to probably understand. And to get a snapshot of what these fees are, here's a fee schedule that Broadridge posted for 2019. I couldn't find one for 2020. So a bunch of these fees are regulated by the New York Stock Exchange rules, particularly Rule 451, which establishes the maximum approved rates that can be charged. So under the NYSE's Rule 451 and 465, the NYSE and the SEC are required to bless how much Broadridge can charge for some of their fees. This rate setting exercise occurs every so often, with the last rate setting taking place in 2013, I believe. So as part of this fee setting process, the public is allowed to comment, and then the SEC issues an approval order to set the new fees going forward, which will last 5-10 years. So the upshot is that for companies, Broadridge is a key player for you to run your annual meeting. You'll be sending Broadridge a draft of your proxy card so that they can then draw up their voting instruction form. They're going to look very similar. See my Vid-Guide about proxy cards, which includes a discussion about VIFs, links to which is below. And then Broadridge will be the one reporting out how the vote's looking like over time as the VIFs are returned to Broadridge. So you're going to have a Broadridge representative that you're going to get to know well if you're in-house. So the third thing I want to mention is end-to-end vote confirmations. Given the importance of Broadridge's role in the proxy plumbing mix, it regularly meets with the SEC. And it has an independent steering committee that it's had for a couple of decades that involves different constituents in the proxy plumbing process. And this steering committee is involved in some of the projects to help improve the proxy plumbing process, something that the SEC has been working on for, I think, about 15 years now. So one hot topic right now is end-to-end vote confirmations. Think blockchain for voting. And in 2019, the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee recommended a pilot program for end-to-end. The way this works is that shareholders would have the ability to see through the chain of intermediaries, there are many of them, to confirm that when they vote their shares, they actually do get vote as directed, because there's this crazy practice out there called share lending that complicates how shares get voted, and there's little transparency regarding these share lending practices. The scope of what share lending is beyond the scope of this Vid-Guide. I will cover that one day in a separate Vid-Guide. Broadridge has created a method for institutional investors to use an online end-to-end voting confirmation system, but I've read that the uptake using that system has been slow, so maybe there really isn't much of a demand for it. That system is not available for retail holders yet. So this end-to-end isn't here in the US today. So notably, the Australian Securities Exchange is planning to launch a blockchain settlement system in 2021. So it looks like it's just a matter of time before we see that sort of thing implemented here in the States. The fourth thing I'm going to discuss is that Broadridge is a big host of virtual annual meetings, a topic that has been quite a big deal over the past year with the pandemic and all. Broadridge is the largest host of virtual annual meetings. Broadridge literally had the market all to themselves, other than a handful of companies that basically self-hosted their annual meetings when they did them virtually. But the explosive growth in this market last year has led other providers to enter the market. Through half of 2020, Broadridge had hosted over 1,300 virtual stockholders meetings compared to just 326 for all of 2019. So I have a bunch of Vid-Guides about virtual shareholder meetings. So go to zippypoint.com for those, or search YouTube with the hashtags of hashtag virtual meetings and hashtag Zippy Point. And the fifth thing I'll mention is that Broadridge does act as a transfer agent. They got into this business about a decade ago. And according to this survey by Audit Analytics, Broadridge is the fifth largest transfer agent with just about 3% of the transfer agent market share. And that's about the same market share that Broadridge had about 5 years ago. They haven't really moved the needle much, but this enables them to handle a company's registered owner base as well as the retail owner base, in which it has a near monopoly. Anyways, let me know what you think.